65 years have passed since the people of Mayberry first appeared on American television screens, and what happened to the men and women behind those characters is a story filled with grief, triumph, quiet reinvention, and endings that no viewer sitting in front of a black and white set in 1960 could have imagined. One of them died 8 days before her 87th birthday, and the only creatures who had kept her company in her final years were 14 cats in a home slowly falling apart around her. Another was the most beloved comedian in the country, and nobody watching him perform had any idea what had been living inside his chest since childhood. A third auditioned for one of the most iconic roles in science fiction history, turned it down, and went on to become the face of a character that followed him across 5 decades. And one of them, the small boy with the fishing pole, grew up in front of an entire nation's eyes, won the Academy Award for Best Picture, and is still working today at the age of 72. Floyd the Barber's Shop was the true gathering place of Mayberry, not the courthouse, not the Taylor kitchen, but that warm, unhurried room where the important conversations of small-town life always seemed to find their way. Howard McNear played Floyd with a murmuring, distracted tenderness that made every scene feel like stepping into something comfortable and half-remembered. He was 55 years old when the show began in the fall of 1960. And what no viewer at home could see was that the man behind the warmth was about to face a crisis that would redefine everything he had left. Howard Turbell McNear was born on January 27, 1905, in Los Angeles, California. He studied at the Oatman School of Theater and later joined a stock company in San Diego, building a foundation in live performance before his career found its true home in a medium almost nobody today remembers: radio. McNear became one of the most versatile radio actors of his era, voicing characters across dozens of programs through the late 1930s and 1940s, including a role in the beloved 1937 seasonal fantasy serial The Cinnamon Bear and a recurring part in Speed Gibson of the International Secret Police. His most significant radio work came as Dr. Charles Doc Adams on CBS Radio's Gunsmoke, a role he inhabited from 1952 to 1961, giving voice to a character millions of Americans knew and cared about without ever associating a face with the name. He served in the United States Army Air Corps during World War II. His screen debut came in 1953, and he accumulated more than 100 film and television credits across the following decade and a half. He was also, though few people knew it, a painter. He created artwork throughout his life, with the same quiet absorption he brought to everything he did. Don Knotts, who knew him well, once remarked that playing Floyd wasn't much of a stretch for McNear, that his real personality was, in essential ways, pretty much like Floyd to begin with. McNear confirmed this himself, telling the Los Angeles Times that he was painfully shy and felt genuinely at home only when on a stage or in front of a microphone. Meeting people, he said, was far harder than performing. Perhaps that explained the quality that made Floyd so recognizable: the distracted warmth, the habit of finding comfort in the familiar, the gentle retreat from anything demanding. It was not a performance of shyness. It was shyness, given form and purpose. Floyd's meandering tangents, his gentle confusions, his habit of trailing off before he arrived at the point. None of that came from the scripts. It was McNear's invention, shaped across seasons into one of the most quietly recognizable recurring characters on American television. In 1963, during his 3rd year on the show, McNear suffered a severe stroke that left him partially paralyzed on his left side, affecting most of his left arm and his legs. He was absent from Mayberry for more than a year. Andy Griffith himself drove the effort to bring him back, not because the scripts required Floyd, but because McNear needed the work and the community of the set. When he returned, the production adapted without drawing attention to it. He was filmed primarily seated, positioned behind the barber's chair, the camera angle adjusted to accommodate what his body could and could not do. The writers never addressed it. His colleagues treated him with the same warmth and professionalism as before. Later episodes sometimes used a brace to prop him up when a standing shot was unavoidable. Audiences felt something moving in those later Floyd scenes without ever fully understanding what it was. They were watching a man performing the work he loved, in the body he had remaining, in a room full of people who cared about him too much to make it into anything other than a normal afternoon at the shop. Howard McNear died on January 3, 1969, in San Clemente, California, from complications related to that stroke at the age of 63. He had been 55 when Mayberry opened its doors. He never saw 64. The barbershop, in the show's final season, was quieter without him. All of Mayberry was. There is an alternate version of television history in which George Lindsay became Mr. Spock. Gene Roddenberry himself had Lindsay in mind for the role. The offer was extended and Lindsay turned it down. The mind stretches trying to picture the man in Goober's beanie on the bridge of the Enterprise, and then accepts the impossibility of it, because George Lindsay was too completely himself to have been anyone's pointed-eared Vulcan. He became Goober instead, and Goober, in the way that only truly inhabited characters can manage, turned out to be just as permanent. George Lindsay was born on December 17, 1928, in Fairfield, Alabama, and grew up in the small town of Jasper, where his aunt ran a gas station. The mechanics there wore felt caps to keep the grease from dripping onto their hair. Those caps, years later, on a California soundstage, became Goober's beanie. He was a serious enough athlete to earn a football scholarship to Florence State Teachers College, serving as the team's starting quarterback. He graduated in 1952 with a degree in bioscience and briefly worked as a high school science teacher, a fact that adds a certain dimension to every scene in which Goober confidently holds forth on subjects he barely understands. Then he made the decision that altered his life. He left the classroom for acting, worked his way to New York, and from New York to Hollywood. He first auditioned for Gomer Pyle in 1962 at the age of 33 and lost the role to Jim Nabors. 2 years later, when Nabors left the show to headline his own spin-off, the call came. Goober Pyle, Gomer's cousin, the filling station mechanic, a man of simple pleasures and surprising loyalty, was written as a temporary replacement. He became one of the show's most enduring presences instead. Lindsay was 35 years old when the character debuted. He stayed for 4 seasons of The Andy Griffith Show, 3 more on Mayberry RFD, and then 22 years on Hee Haw, where he wore the Goober suit in every broadcast from 1971 until the show ended production in 1993. He wore it in live stand-up performances. He wore it at fan conventions, charity events, and community fundraisers for the rest of his life. He embraced the character without reservation or resentment, understanding that the role had given something real to millions of people, and that this was, in its own way, a significant thing to have contributed to the world. In 1998, he helped launch the George Lindsay UNA Film Festival at the University of North Alabama and stayed actively involved until the very end. The role he had turned down, Spock, the half-human, half-Vulcan science officer of the Enterprise, went to Leonard Nimoy and made Nimoy's name permanently. Lindsay apparently bore no regret about it. He had found his own permanent name in a different register entirely. George Lindsay died on May 6, 2012, in Nashville, Tennessee, after a brief illness at the age of 83. He was buried in Jasper, Alabama, the town where his aunt's gas station had given him the hat. He was 83 years old. Andy Griffith, who attended almost no funerals at that stage of his own life, issued a statement. His fondest memories of show business were the years he spent in Mayberry. They were mine too. She was the heart of Mayberry, and everyone who watched believed in her completely. Frances Bavier moved through those episodes with an authority that felt entirely natural. The warm, capable woman at the center of the Taylor household. The moral gravity around which everything else arranged itself. What almost nobody knew, for decades, was how deeply she resented the role. Not out of ingratitude, but out of the particular anguish of a serious artist who discovers too late that the work she is best known for has swallowed every other version of herself. Frances Elizabeth Bavier was born on December 14, 1902, near Gramercy Park in New York City. She originally planned to become a teacher, enrolled at Columbia University, and then found her way to the American Academy of Dramatic Arts instead. Her Broadway debut came in 1925, when she was 22 years old. She stepped in as understudy in the Broadway production of On Borrowed Time, replacing the lead actress and completing the run. She performed in vaudeville. She traveled with the USO to the Pacific during World War II, entertaining troops far from home in theaters and makeshift performance spaces across the islands. Her final Broadway appearance came in 1951, opposite Henry Fonda in Point of No Return, which ran for 356 performances. That same year, she made her film debut in The Day the Earth Stood Still, a science fiction classic whose cast included, without either performer knowing it at the time, another actor who would one day be her on-screen neighbor. The film also featured Olin Soul, who would later play Mayberry's choir director, John Masters. The two had been boarders in the same fictional rooming house. A decade later, they were neighbors in the same fictional small town. She was 57 years old when The Andy Griffith Show began in 1960. She would spend 10 years in the role, 8 seasons, then 2 more on the spin-off Mayberry RFD. In 1967, she won the Emmy Award for Outstanding Supporting Comedy Actress. Professionally, she was considered impeccable. Personally, she was, by most accounts of those who worked alongside her, deeply difficult, cold, temperamental, and unable to find comfort in the camaraderie the rest of the cast seemed to develop naturally. She was married once, briefly and unhappily, to a man named Russell Carpenter in 1928. They divorced 5 years later over conflicting career ambitions, and she never remarried. Andy Griffith clashed with her repeatedly across the show's run. Ron Howard, who played Opie across all 8 seasons, said as carefully as he could manage that he didn't think she had particularly enjoyed being around children. What those around her may not have fully grasped was how much the role was costing her. She said in the 1970s, "I had played Aunt Bee for 10 years, and it is very, very difficult for an actress to create a role and be so identified with it that you as a person no longer exist." She retired in 1970. Her last screen credit was in 1974, a small role in the film Benji, a movie about a dog. In 1972, she moved to Siler City, North Carolina, as far from New York as she could reasonably get, while reigning in a world that had some connection to the character that had consumed her. And she rarely left the house again. She lived with 14 cats. Her home, found in serious disrepair after her death, bore witness to years of isolation. She died on December 6, 1989, 8 days before her 87th birthday from congestive heart failure. She had been alone. She left most of her $700,000 estate to a hospital foundation and $100,000 to the Siler City Police Department, a quiet and unexpected final gesture to the community that had let her live in peace without making demands of her. 1 month before she died, she reached out to Andy Griffith. They made their peace. He visited. Whatever had accumulated between them across 30 years, the friction, the clashes, the silences, they set aside. It was the last important thing she did, and it carries more weight than most of what either of them ever said on camera. She was there at the very beginning, and then she was gone, and the show continued as if she had never existed, which was, on some level, exactly what she had asked for. Eleanor Donahue played Ellie Walker, the Mayberry pharmacist and Sheriff Taylor's first love interest, for 11 episodes of the first season. She was 23 years old when the show premiered. Then, in an act of professional honesty that takes considerably more courage than it usually receives credit for, she asked to be released from a 3-year contract, and the producers said yes. Her departure from season 2 was never addressed or explained on screen. Mayberry simply moved on. Mary Eleanor Donahue was born on April 19, 1937, in Tacoma, Washington, and had been performing professionally since she was a toddler. Universal Studios signed her at the age of 5. She spent years in minor film roles at MGM, appearing alongside Elizabeth Taylor in The Unfinished Dance, and again in Love is Better Than Ever before she was a teenager, and attained her first genuine national fame in 1954 when she was cast as Betty Anderson, the eldest daughter of the ideal American family on Father Knows Best. 6 seasons of that show, which ran until 1960, made her one of the most recognizable faces in American television. The transition from Betty Anderson to Ellie Walker proved harder than anyone anticipated, moving from playing a teenager within a warm family to playing a fully independent adult capable of standing as an equal to a charming, confident sheriff felt, to Donahue like stepping into someone else's clothes before you were ready to fill them. She told Woman's World in a 2025 interview, "I felt like a bird out of a nest. I didn't feel like I had all my feathers yet. I didn't feel capable." She also noted with striking candor that she didn't think there was any real chemistry between herself and Griffith, that the pairing simply didn't feel alive to her. There was, she said, No point in continuing with something she was not doing properly. After 11 episodes, she walked away from the contract. The decision was right. That doesn't make it easy. What followed was a long, quietly distinguished career. She appeared in the Star Trek episode Metamorphosis. She was opposite Tony Randall for 13 episodes of The Odd Couple. She appeared in Days of Our Lives, in The Young and the Restless, in Pretty Woman in 1990. She had a role in The Princess Diaries 2, Royal Engagement in 2004. She married television producer Harry Ackerman in 1962. A marriage that held for nearly 30 years, until his death in 1991. She has been married to Lou Genovrino since 1992. In 2026, Eleanor Donahue is 89 years old, retired from the screen, and living in Palm Desert, California. She contributed personal reflections to the 2025 book 65 Years of Mayberry, a new celebration of the Andy Griffith Show. The woman who once felt she had not yet grown her feathers has been flying steadily and covering remarkable distances for more than 60 years. He opened his mouth and spoke, and the whole country recognized that high, slow, lilting southern drawl immediately. Then he opened his mouth again to sing, and nobody in the room recognized anything at all. The voice that emerged was the voice of a completely different man. That was the central mystery of Jim Nabors. The most famous innocent on American television was, in private, one of the most genuinely sophisticated and culturally complex performers of his generation. The gap between the speaking voice and the singing voice was so enormous that many people simply refused to believe they belonged to the same body. James Thurston Nabors was born on June 12, 1930, in Sylacauga, Alabama, the youngest of 3 children. Severe childhood asthma kept him from the sports that dominated Alabama boyhood and pushed him toward the performing arts, where he found both expression and purpose. He earned a business degree from the University of Alabama and briefly worked as a court reporter in New York, which means that, for a period of time, the most recognizable voice in American comedy was spending its days in silent transcription, recording other people's words. He relocated to California, began performing in clubs, and was discovered by comedian Bill Dana. He appeared on The Steve Allen Show. Then Andy Griffith saw his act at the Horn Club in Santa Monica, recognized an essential quality in the character, and invited him to come in and read. Nabors was 32 years old when Gomer Pyle first appeared on screen. The character, the wide-eyed, good-natured filling station attendant whose exclamation "Gall-Gally" was stretched over 4 or 5 syllables of pure, uncomplicated delight, and whose catchphrase Shazam borrowed the enthusiasm of a child who has just discovered something impossible, debuted in 1962 and was a genuine sensation almost immediately. When Gomer was spun off into his own series, Gomer Pyle, USMC, in 1964, the new show became a top 5 series for 4 of its 5 seasons. It was, for a period, one of the most watched programs on American television. What audiences did not suspect was that Nabors' speaking voice had almost nothing to do with the voice he used when recording music. His singing voice, a deep, operatic baritone, warm and precise and genuinely beautiful, bore no relationship to Gomer's drawl. He recorded more than 30 albums. He received 5 gold records. He sang Back Home Again in Indiana at the Indianapolis 500 nearly every year, from 1972 to 2014, a tradition that lasted for 4 decades. His 1980 album, The Heart-Touching Magic of Jim Nabors, went platinum. What the public did not know for nearly 4 decades was that Nabors had been in a relationship with Honolulu firefighter Stan Cadwallader since 1975. They had met when Cadwallader was on active duty. They had been together, quietly, for 38 years. When same-sex marriage became legal in Washington state, Nabors married Cadwallader in Seattle in January 2013, at the age of 82. "It's pretty obvious that we had no rights as a couple," Nabors said. "When you've been together 38 years, something's got to solidify." He had survived a liver transplant in 1994 and heart surgery in 2012. His immune system remained suppressed for the rest of his life. His health declined seriously in late 2016. On November 30th, 2017, Jim Nabors died peacefully at his home in Honolulu, with Cadwallader beside him. He was 87 years old. In 2013, the United States Marine Corps his fictional professional home for 5 seasons of television, honored him with the title of Honorary Sergeant. Burt Reynolds said he had a bigger appetite for life than anyone Reynolds had ever known. Ron Howard remembered him as intelligent and worldly in ways the public was never allowed to see behind the character. The man who played America's most famously guileless soul had been, the whole time, one of its more quietly remarkable people. There has never been anyone quite like him on American television, and there probably never will be again. Don Knotts took a character who could have been a simple recurring joke, the bumbling, self-important deputy who cannot quite keep pace with the world, and turned him into something that transcended comedy entirely. Barney Fife was genuinely human, desperate, lovable, terrified of his own inadequacy, and somehow, despite everything, capable of a heroism that lands harder for being so unlikely. The 5 Emmy Awards Don Knotts won for the role are among the most deserved trophies in the history of American television. And behind that performance was a man who had been carrying real fear since the age of 13, and who spent his entire career turning it into something the rest of the world could laugh at and love. Jesse Donald Knotts was born on July 21, 1924, in Morgantown, West Virginia, the youngest of 4 sons, and arrived in the world 14 years after his next closest sibling, an accidental child in every sense of the word. He slept on a cot in the kitchen while his brothers shared the bedroom with the family's boarder. His father, William Knotts, was a farmer who suffered a nervous breakdown, lost his land, and descended into schizophrenia, alcoholism, and what one account described as hysterical blindness. He sometimes threatened his young son with a knife. He died when Don was 13. His mother, Elsie, ran a boarding house to keep the family afloat. There was almost no money and almost no stability. What Don had was a wooden ventriloquist dummy he had constructed himself and named Danny, the first character he ever built, before he fully understood what building a character meant. He performed with Danny at church events and school functions around Morgantown. He was elected president of his senior class and wrote a humor column for the school newspaper. He cleaned chickens at a local grocery store to earn spending money. He tried New York City after high school and lasted only a few weeks before returning home to enroll at West Virginia University. When World War II intervened, Knotts enlisted and was assigned to the 6,817th Special Services Battalion, touring the Western Pacific Islands with an Army variety show called Stars and Gripes. It was during this period, somewhere in the South Pacific, on a ship, during a moment of either clarity or frustration, that he threw Danny overboard. The dummy had been getting more laughs than he was. He decided to remove the competition. He never did ventriloquism again. He returned from the war, completed his degree from West Virginia University in 1948, and made his way back to New York, where Steve Allen's television show eventually gave his nervous man character a national platform. He had discovered, somewhere between the Pacific and West Virginia, that anxiety itself was the material, that the thing he had been living with since childhood could be made into something people laughed at and recognized and loved. It was the most profound creative discovery of his life. He met Andy Griffith on a Broadway stage in 1955, and the friendship formed between them would define both their careers for the next 50 years. Knotts was 35 years old when the Andy Griffith Show began. For 5 seasons, Knotts made Barney Fife the reason millions of Americans sat down every week. He left in 1965, believing, incorrectly as history would demonstrate, that the show was ending. He had already signed a film deal with Universal Studios. The show continued for 3 more years without him. He made periodic guest returns as Barney and won 2 additional Emmy Awards for those appearances, bringing his total to 5, still the record for a supporting performer in a comedy series. In the late 1970s, he found a second major television home on Three's Company, playing would-be swinger landlord Ralph Furley. A different kind of nervous, a different kind of lovable, across 6 seasons. He received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 2000. He worked in film, in theater, and in voice acting until near the very end of his life. His 3rd marriage to actress Frances Yarborough in 2002 held until his death. In 2025, Ron Howard publicly confirmed a discovery made after Knotts' death. The 2 men, Opie and Barney, the boy and the deputy, are distant cousins. Nobody had known during Knotts' lifetime. The revelation that they were family in a small literal sense that echoed the larger fictional sense seemed entirely fitting for a friendship that had been shaped, almost from the beginning, by something that felt like blood. Don Knotts died on February 24, 2006, in Los Angeles, from pulmonary and respiratory complications related to lung cancer. He was 81 years old. He had been 35 when Barney Fife first walked into the Mayberry courthouse. Barney's single bullet, kept in his breast pocket, reserved for the emergency that never quite arrived, was one of the most enduring running jokes in the history of American television. The man who carried it deserved every moment of laughter it ever produced, and understood better than anyone what that laughter was really about. He was 6 years old when he got the part. A small boy with a fishing pole and an expression of absolute sincerity, who would grow up in front of a national audience to become one of the most powerful filmmakers in the history of American cinema. Ron Howard's journey from Opie Taylor to the Academy Award is not a story of luck or accident. It is the story of a child who paid close, serious attention to everything happening around him, absorbed lessons from every talented person he worked alongside, and spent the next 6 decades applying what he had learned with a consistency that is, in its own way, extraordinary. Ronald William Howard was born on March 1, 1954, in Duncan, Oklahoma, into a family already immersed in performance. His father, Rance Howard, was a director and actor. His mother was an actress. His younger brother Clint would also spend his career in front of cameras. When Ron was cast as Opie at the age of 6, he had already appeared in commercials and small roles since infancy. But Opie Taylor was the role that defined his childhood for a generation, and the years in Mayberry that followed constituted an education in craft and collaboration that no film school could have provided. Griffith was deeply and genuinely paternal toward the boy. He created an atmosphere on set of warmth and creative freedom that Howard would later describe as foundational to his understanding of what a healthy, productive production looks and feels like, of how a person at the center of a project can set a tone that either lifts everyone around them or diminishes them. Howard paid attention. During the show's run, he also worked beside young guest performers who would later become significant figures. Jodie Foster appeared in an episode. The education was comprehensive in ways that only became fully visible in retrospect. When the show ended in 1968, Howard continued acting, most visibly as Richie Cunningham on Happy Days through most of the 1970s, where a new generation came to know him, and in American Graffiti in 1973. In 1980, at the age of 26, he stepped away from acting voluntarily to direct. What followed demonstrated that the decision was correct. Splash, Cocoon, Willow, Backdraft, Apollo 13, A Beautiful Mind. Each film built on the last, and in 2002, A Beautiful Mind won Ron Howard both the Academy Award for Best Director and the Academy Award for Best Picture. The films he has directed have grossed more than $2 billion domestically, making him one of the highest-earning directors in the history of the medium. His production company, Imagine Entertainment, co-founded with Brian Grazer in 1986, became one of the most significant forces in Hollywood, producing major films and series including 24, Friday Night Lights, and Arrested Development. In 2024, Howard directed Eden, a dark survival thriller set in the 1929 Galapagos Islands, starring Jude Law and Ana de Armas, which premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival. In 2025, he co-wrote the memoir, The Boys, a memoir of Hollywood and family with his brother Clint. Also in 2025, it was publicly confirmed that Ron Howard and Don Knotts are distant cousins, a connection that nobody had discovered during Knotts' lifetime. The revelation that Opie and Barney were, in a small literal sense, actually family adds a footnote to the story of two men who spent 5 years pretending to be the most important relationship in a fictional small town's life. In 2026, Ron Howard is 72 years old, still directing, still producing, still moving forward with the purposefulness that has defined everything he has ever done. He is the last surviving member of the main cast of The Andy Griffith Show, of the small boy who grew up in front of a nation that never stopped watching. That much can be said, without qualification. He turned out fine, better than fine. And finally, him, the man without whom Mayberry would have been just another period sitcom on a crowded schedule. Andy Griffith was not simply playing a character. He was presenting a vision of decency, of patience, a particular authority that derives from wisdom rather than force. And he presented it so convincingly for 8 consecutive seasons that the boundary between the man and the role dissolved permanently in the American imagination. He was 33 years old when the series began in the fall of 1960. He brought to it a history that the character's folksy warmth carefully and deliberately concealed, because Andy Griffith was, from early in his career, a performer of considerably deeper range and darker potential than he ever allowed most audiences to see. Andy Samuel Griffith was born on June 1, 1926, in Mount Airy, North Carolina, a small town in the Blue Ridge foothills that would later become the obvious unacknowledged original of Mayberry. His family was working class and struggled through the Depression. He grew up in a house his father Carl built with his own hands. As a boy, Andy wanted to become an opera singer. Then he decided he wanted to become a Moravian preacher, influenced by a minister in Mount Airy who had taken an interest in him and arranged for private trombone lessons. He enrolled at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 1944 as a pre-divinity student, drifted into the drama department, and graduated in 1949 with a degree in music. He taught high school music in Goldsboro, North Carolina for 3 years before turning fully to performing. His first nationally recognized performance was not on stage or screen. It was a comedy record. What it was Football, released in November 1953 by a Chapel Hill record company and quickly picked up by Capitol Records, was a monologue narrated by a bewildered country boy watching a football game without understanding any of it. It sold 1 million copies. It revealed something Griffith would spend decades exploring and sometimes concealing, a gift for inhabiting deliberate simplicity that was, at every level, the product of sophisticated craft. The persona was the instrument, the country boy was the performance. Broadway came in 1955, in No Time for Sergeants, the production in which he first met Don Knotts, and set in motion a friendship that would define both their careers for the next 50 years. He was nominated for a Tony Award. He reprised the role in the 1958 film. But the most revealing and arguably the most important statement of what Andy Griffith was genuinely capable of came in 1957, when director Elia Kazan cast him as Larry Lonesome Rhodes in A Face in the Crowd, a charismatic, calculating media demagogue whose contempt for the masses he manipulates is concealed perfectly behind a performance of homespun Southern charm. Kazan had first seen Griffith in No Time for Sergeants and was not certain the amiable comedian could play genuine menace. At the audition, Griffith did a spirited imitation of the televangelist Oral Roberts, drawing on the evangelists he had watched as a boy in Mount Airy. And Kazan recognized immediately that he had been wrong. Griffith later recalled, "At that moment, he and Bud Schulberg could both see I had a wild side." A Face in the Crowd was his film debut. The movie did not succeed at the box office initially. Its critical reputation grew across the following decades until it is now considered one of the defining American films of the 1950s. The country, which wanted Andy Taylor, was not ready to absorb what Lonesome Rhodes implied about the man behind the sheriff's badge. The Andy Griffith Show ran from 1960 to 1968, 249 episodes, 8 seasons. It never fell below 7th in the annual Nielsen ratings. In its final 2 seasons, it finished first. It was the only show in American television history to end its run at number 1. When the show concluded, Griffith worked steadily until 1986, when Matlock arrived, the legal drama in which he played Ben Matlock, a cunning defense attorney whose folksy courtroom persona concealed a sharp legal mind. It ran for 9 seasons and reminded audiences that the man had always been more than the character suggested. He recorded gospel music alongside his acting career. A 1996 album called I Love to Tell the Story, 25 timeless hymns won him a Grammy Award, one of the least expected Grammy victories in the history of that award, from a man full of unexpected dimensions. He survived Guillain-Barré syndrome in the early 1980s, a neurological condition that caused partial paralysis. He recovered and discussed it rarely. He was married 3 times, to Barbara Bray Edwards, briefly to the Greek actress Salisa Casuto, and finally and lastingly to Cindy Knight in 1983, a former actress and teacher who remained with him until the end. In 2005, President George W. Bush awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. On July 3, 2012, Andy Griffith died at his home on Roanoke Island, North Carolina, of a heart attack at the age of 86. His family buried him within 5 hours of his death on the island he loved, in accordance with wishes he had made clear years in advance. He was gone before most of the country had heard the news. His death came less than 2 months after George Lindsay's. That summer of 2012 was the summer Mayberry truly ended. Not the show, which still runs, but the world behind it. He once said, "When you're young, you think you will always be. As you become more fragile, you reflect, and you realize how much comfort can come from the past." 65 years after it first aired, The Andy Griffith Show remains one of the most continuously watched programs in American television history. The reruns still run. The fans still gather every September in Mount Airy for Mayberry Days. The fishing poles are still out there. And somewhere in the collective memory of everyone who ever sat in front of a television set and felt, for 30 minutes, that the world was manageable and decent and worth being in. Andy Taylor is still walking down the main street of Mayberry with his son beside him, unhurried, untroubled, at peace, which was always, from the very beginning, exactly the point. Tell us in the comments which of these stories surprised you most, and where in the world are you watching from today? If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, the real lives behind the familiar faces, subscribe to this channel and ring the bell. Every week, we go past the legend and into the life.